Okay, I think we can get started. It's a pleasure today to have here with us Professor Alex Szalay, who comes from, is the director of the Institute for Data Intensive Science at Johns Hopkins University. And Professor Szalay is a cosmologist with interest especially in the study of large-scale structure and clustering of galaxies, who gave major contribution to cosmology in this field over the years. He's also a Bloomberg Distinguished Professor, corresponding member of the Hungarian Academy of Science, fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Science, recipient of a von Humboldt Award for Physical Sciences, and of a Microsoft Jim Gray Award. And again, it's a pleasure to have Alex with us today, who's going to talk about new challenges in astrophysics with large data sets.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here at one of the world's oldest universities. And I was really very interested in learning about your new program about the physics of data. So in the US, data science is becoming now very, very fashionable and hot. And many universities started a data science program, but as far as I know, this is the only program which really ties physics and data so closely. And I think actually a lot of the big data efforts all over the world have grown out of physics, from particle physics and also out of astronomy. And so I would like to talk today about, what are the special challenges as the data sets in sciences are becoming quite large, and how do we deal with it, and what the future holds. So these are kind of the big challenges: scalability and computability. Then, what is the nature of the statistical errors? What is the nature of errors that we have to deal with? And then how can we make our methods more robust? And I will explain a little what robust really means. How can we use basically simulations in new ways? And then what are the sociological changes happening in science as a result of all this? So what is the scalability challenge? So by and large, our budgets in science have not changed over hundreds of years. So probably the peak was Tycho Brahe's observatory in Denmark, which was a large percentage of the gross national product of Denmark at the time. But since then, the budgets have pretty much stayed flat. And so the power of computers, everyone knows Moore's law. That, every 18 months, or these days, often one says that every 12 months, the power of computers for the same price roughly doubles. And as it turns out, when you look at data, mostly in physical sciences, then the amount of data that we collect is also roughly doubling every year. And when you think about this is pretty remarkable, because this means that over the last 12 months, we have collected as much data as from the beginning of science. So, and this has, on the other hand, very severe implications. So the premise is that in the future, the algorithms that we use for the analysis of data, there are the scaling laws in computer science, that how does an algorithm's computational cost scale with the number of points, number of data items. And my premise is that we will only be able to do algorithms which are n log n. Let me explain why. So imagine, for example, the traditional statistics. If we have n data points, but they are not independent, they have a covariance matrix. If we have n data points, the covariance matrix has the size of n squared elements. And if I want to invert that to basically do the best estimator, then the inverse of an n squared matrix has a computational cost of n cubed. So imagine now the world when n is doubling every year. So today I have a computational cost of 1 in this method. Next year n is twice as large, so my computational cost will be 8 times larger. But because of Moore's law, my computers are going to get faster, but they are only getting twice as fast. So next year, what took me 1 day to compute, it will take 4 days to compute. And if I wait another year, it will be basically 16 times, 16 days. So basically it's getting out of hand. So it turns out that when we define what is an optimum estimator, this dates back to the days of Gauss. So when we had 10 data points in an experiment, so the statistical variance due to the small number of points was so large, and the computational cost was minimal. We could do it on pencil or paper. So the optimum, we traded everything to get the minimum statistical variance. Today, on the other hand, we have billions of data points, and the problem is no longer statistical. Square root of n of a billion is tiny, and square root of n of a trillion even smaller. So basically, the statistical variance of all this is totally irrelevant. But usually, these trillion data points don't come from a single experiment. They are coming from many different places. And this is also true, when we are analyzing big data in society. And so every experiment will have a slightly different systematics, so different biases, and which are much, much larger than the statistical variance. So we have to use different techniques to get rid of those. And finally, there are certain systematic errors that there's no matter what we do, we can't get rid of them. So then why should we perform these extremely expensive computations to minimize the statistical variance when it's meaningless? Because it's not going to make our data and the results better. So why don't we come up with algorithms where we can actually control the accuracy of the computation? And so essentially, we can get the best result in a minute, the best result in an hour, best result in a day, best result in a week, best result in a month. And we can decide what is more important, getting the result a quick and not so accurate answer, or we want to actually crunch for a little bit longer. And there are actually algorithms which enable us to do this, in particular where we don't look at every data item all at once in one block, but we keep kind of adding data, and as we crunch on the data, the results are getting more and more accurate. It's converging to a final value, and we can choose to stop at any point. These are the so-called incremental algorithms, and the special version of, and sometimes incremental and randomized are kind of synonyms in this world, and very often this also materialize as streaming algorithms, because very often we don't even have the ability to store all the data at once. They are coming online like they are coming off of the detector at CERN. Okay, so the events are coming at such a rate that we can't afford to store them. So we actually sample them using hardware triggers, and we only store 1 out of 10 million events that comes off the detector. Okay, and that is still 10 petabytes per year, which keeps the whole particle physics community happy. And I will mention this. So essentially, we have to rethink the way we do the analysis, and we organize the algorithms when we organize our data, and we may actually store everything on an external storage, and we always just kind of stream it through the system that we look at every data item at most once. So this is kind of how the future goes. Okay, let me jump through. So there is an interesting, then there are other interesting issues. So in physics and in astrophysics, very often the quantities that we want to measure and we want to sample, they are actually very skewed, they have a very skewed distribution. The cosmological density is one such example. So being a cosmologist, I can't help to bring us some of the examples from there. It turns out that there is a physical, so when we look at, so this equation is the continuity equation in comoving coordinates. So some of you who are doing cosmology may be familiar with this. And we rewrite everything in comoving coordinates and so-called conformal time. Turns out one can rewrite this equation in a way that on the right-hand side we have the divergence of the velocity, and on the left-hand side, we have the time derivative of the log of the density. Okay, and this was done in the 90s by Bernard Jones and Peter Coles. And turns out that very early on in the universe, the fluctuation when the fluctuations are very small, then the divergence of velocity is very close to a Gaussian field. And so therefore, it turns out that the log of the density is also a Gaussian field. And as the density, as the fluctuations grow, at some point they are becoming much bigger. And so suddenly what we see is that the density distribution, while the velocities are still Gaussian, the density distribution starts to be so-called Lognormal. So that basically the log, it's a Gaussian of the log of the density, which means that it will have a very extended tail. So the Lognormal distribution is very often happening in nature in multiplicative processes. Anyway, but so this picture shows just the difference between a plot of the density and what would be the distribution for the log of the density. And this is still not quite a Gaussian. How does this materialize when we show actually the same density field in these different mappings? All that we do here, by the way, is just relabel the contours of the density. So the left side shows the density, and you can see because of the long tail, there are a small number of cells in this picture. This is coming from an n-body simulation, from the Millennium Simulation. There are a couple of cells which have a very high density. This is the tail of the distribution. And we don't see much. When I plot it in the logarithmic coordinates, this is like doing if I did image processing on this image, taking the log of the image means that I kind of pull back this long tail and bring everything much, much closer. I decrease the contrast of the image. Okay? And you can see that one can start to see all these structures. Turns out when I try to compute the power spectrum of this, turns out that all this in the power spectrum here, power spectrum is, I hope you are familiar with what power spectrum is. So basically it's the Fourier transform of the density field, and the very high K values are the very high spatial frequencies. So if we have very tight and dense clusters, we add a lot of high spatial frequencies. This is why basically this curve shows such a long tail compared to the initial. So the red curve was how we started this cosmological simulation. But once we analyze the power spectrum of just doing the log of the density, it's obvious that the shape is identical to the initial conditions. So we have actually eliminated a lot of these very high frequencies by bringing them, by essentially reducing the contrast. Why was I saying this? So in many data sets, if we want to randomly sample, okay, if we have a very skewed distribution with a very long tail, doesn't really work. So imagine that I have a vector with 1 million elements, all is 1. No matter how well I sample, the probability of me hitting this one is 1 in 1 million. Okay. How can we sample this in an intelligent way? Imagine I Fourier transform this. So maybe let me draw here. So I have this vector, and then there is one spike here, and everything else is 0. Okay, so I Fourier transform it. This is essentially a Dirac delta. If I Fourier transform everything, I will have a uniform, so the Fourier amplitudes will all be 1. And the location of the Dirac delta will be stored in the phases, how the different phases of the plane of the waves are actually aligned and adjusted. So what will be the probability distribution of the Fourier amplitudes? Anybody? Okay, so the Fourier transform is a linear transformation. So every Fourier transform is actually coming from a sum of a weighted sum of all the density values, all the values of the vector elements. Okay, so because of central limit theorem, it's a linear combination of, it's a sum, it's a weighted sum of lots of random variables. Because of the central limit theorem, the Fourier amplitudes will be completely Gaussian sampled. So imagine I don't basically take the representation in Fourier space, which will be something like this, and then I randomly sample certain wave numbers. Okay, then I try to use this random sample to reconstruct again this density. What will I get? I will get a noise, of course, because it's very sparsely sampled. And then I get sort of a fairly broad peak, depending on how well I sample. The better sampling I do, the narrower it will get, and the noise will get smaller and smaller. Okay, so the amplitude of the noise here will be roughly 1 over square root of n, where n is the number of samples that I have taken. But if I know then that my original process had just a single spike, then from this one can actually reconstruct the original data very, very well. And generally, I will show some more things about this, but nature is sparse. So natural physical processes usually can be described with a very small number of parameters, which are relevant at a given dynamic range. So with this in mind, it's very interesting to see, can we actually, with sampling, can we find such a representation of the signal where we can characterize it with the smallest possible number of measurements? And so in order to do all these tricks with this, the streaming algorithms and the randomly sampled algorithms that I said, the trick is that we have to sample the right way. And Fourier transform is one example, but generally if I do a linear transformation on a very skewed distribution, so I mix and scramble the elements, create other linear combinations, in general this is going to create actually a Gaussian distributed process. And in particular, in mathematics, recently there has been a lot done on so-called random projections, so that we essentially simply take the signal and mix them with a random matrix. And one can operate much nicer, so this resulting data set has much nicer properties because of this. Okay. So one nice example, so actually the people who were pursuing this, in part, one of the prime person is Emmanuel Candice. So he is a mathematician at Stanford. And he invented something called compressive sensing, together with David Donahoe, also from Stanford. And I think everybody knows about principal components. But so he came up with a very nice idea. So imagine that basically we have a complex signal, and here the archetypical example that I will get to is galaxy spectra. Okay, so that galaxy spectra have typically two components. One is a very broad spectral energy distribution, which is essentially coming from all the stellar light added together from the galaxy. And then there are a couple of very strong emission lines, okay, which are coming from hot gas. But these two are very different physical components. But it turns out that one can take the smooth component and one can typically describe it with 3 to 5 parameters. So if we do a simple normal principal component analysis, if we didn't have the emission lines, one could represent this with of the order of 3 to 5 parameters using principal components. So using essentially, but these are embedded in a very high dimensional space. A spectrum has typically 4,000 resolution elements, but the free parameters is only 5. So which means that I can compose this from 5 orthogonal components. I can reproduce pretty much all the spectra, but not the emission lines, because they are different physics. And so therefore, when we try to expand galaxy spectra this way, we always kind of hit the wall when it came to the emission lines. And then Candice wrote this paper, which was a much more general mathematical paper. He said that what if the signal still remains sparse, but it's sparse in 2 different ways. One is that there is this very broad component which is embedded sparse. But there are a couple of pixels in the spectrum which are sparse essentially in the so-called support. So there are a few pixels where this expansion doesn't count. So it's kind of a direct product of two different sparse processes, two different sparsities. Anyway, and he came up with so can we actually figure out, given the signal, can we come up with a statistical procedure that finds basically these sparse parametrizations? It turns out if we write down the normal cost function, which is the quadratic, so the root mean squared error, or the quadratic error, it is an NP-complete problem, so you cannot find the solution. And he came up with a very elegant way. So he said, why don't we actually try to do the so-called L1 trick? L1 is, L2 is the quadratic norm. L1 is the linear norm where you take the absolute value, the absolute sum of the absolute deviations. And it turns out when in the high dimensional space, you take the sum of these absolute deviations, it turns out that corresponds to kind of a high dimensional but linear minimization. So it becomes an optimization problem that we know how to solve. And in particular, Lagrange multipliers work like a charm. So the idea is, without going into the math, so that we want to represent the signal here in the principal component pursuit, so that X is our data matrix. We want to basically take as a sum of an N matrix. N is the smooth component, which has a few parameters, and A is the sparse component. And we know that basically the rank of the smooth component is like K equals 5. And then we want to find a solution and minimization so that A is the length of A is actually as little as possible. Okay. Let's see how it does on galaxy spectra. So we basically took about 1 million Sloan spectra. This is István Csabai from Budapest, who was a postdoc with me. Okay, so this is the result of a PCA. So we take a typical galaxy and expand it on the PCA basis, but the PCA doesn't know about the emission lines. So it tries to represent it, but you can see that in the residual there are very big errors because it just cannot handle it. The emission lines also have a variable width and so on. They are really horrible for expansion. When we apply the principal component pursuit, it does something really beautiful and amazing. So the blue component, it's separated into the blue and the smooth and the sparse component. And the smooth is not really smooth. It has all the absorption lines of the stellar spectra, which are actually, but they are actually part of the smooth continuum. They all move together because they belong to one physical process. And the emission lines belong to a separate physical process, and it's very nicely separated because they have, when we go through 1 million spectra, they actually are separating very nicely using this technique. So this is an example how actually one can learn something about the physics of the galaxy spectra without actually putting it as a prior. So this automatically classified the different types of features in galaxy spectra. And so the next challenge is systematic errors. Okay, so systematic errors are these little biases in the measurement, which if we know about it and they are kind of in your face, we call it calibration, and we take it out. So the problem is what happens with systematic errors, we are not really aware that they exist, and then we only discover it when we do the analysis and we find something really unexpected. Okay, and then afterwards we start to dig in that. And I would like to show a couple of examples from Sloan, which really drew me crazy. So one was the so-called 0-point errors. So I spent 25 years of my life working on a Sloan digital sky survey, which is a big sky mapping project, generated at this point, probably 100 terabytes of data and about 1 billion objects on the sky. We, again, were very much interested in measuring the power spectrum. And Sloan had a very interesting imaging strategy. Instead of pointing the telescope to a part of the sky and taking an image, so it did something very different. It had a whole mosaic of CCD chips, and we just let the Earth rotate and move the telescope on the sky. And we were always just giving the telescope a little bit of a breathing motion throughout the night so that it always moves on a great circle. So we were taking basically these tangential cylindrical panoramic images of the sky, which were about 1.2 million pixels long, and they were about 2,000 pixels wide. And the trick was that if I take just my camera or open my cell phone, okay, and then let the Earth start to rotate on the sky, every star or galaxy will basically draw a streak on the image. Okay, but you know how we read out the CCDs. That the CCDs are these electronic devices where they have like 2,000 by 2,000 pixels or so, that we clock them, and then the charges are shifted from right to left by 1 pixel at the clock signal. And when the charges hit the edge of the CCD, they are then read out very quickly. They are shifted out this way. So basically, we have these little charge buckets which collect the photoelectrons, that the light from the galaxies, kind of when it's hitting the detector, it creates electrons, and we capture them in a bucket. And when the object is moving on the camera, we actually move the charges to keep it under them. Okay, so such a way, we still get a decent image, but we keep the camera open all night instead of pointing, exposing, pointing, exposing. So, and even this way, the whole project took 15 years to cover the sky. It would have been 30 otherwise if we had to stop and point and expose. Anyway, okay, what's the problem with this? So the sky is, all these images have some systematic errors. We calibrate the camera. We try to take out the CCD's efficiencies and what is the night sky glow at that particular night. But we don't do a very good job. And basically, this means that we have correlated zebra-like stripes on the sky. Even after the calibrations, if I plotted up the number of galaxies in each of these stripes that we have taken, it was very correlated. So there was an imprint simply of the exposure strategy on the sky images. If I look at the surface density of galaxies on Sloan at a given magnitude, I can see the stripes. So one of my students started to think about how can we actually come up with a clever strategy where we can take some of these patterns out because they actually infect the power spectrum measurements. And the problem is that they infect the power spectrum from 120 degrees scales to actually down to 10 arc-minute scales. So it's kind of spewing noise all over the place. And it turns out that, so we were able to come up with a principal component analysis where we essentially defined a subspace corresponding to the zebra stripes. Okay, and we were able to deproject, so we were able to take out that part of the signal, and we kept another part which was related to the cosmological density fluctuations. But essentially, dealing with systematic errors, it's partly an art form. You have to come up with ways when you figure out what are the contaminating signals, model them accurately, and you try to deproject them. So move into a subspace where all this noise is kind of eliminated and subtracted from your signal. So it requires a very exquisite modeling. But there was a much more dramatic thing. So there was a student at Hopkins who came to me and showed he ran the following query on the Sloan. So he just took out galaxies from a little stripe in the middle of Sloan at the equator, where the distortions are the smallest. And the XAB less than 0.2 means that these are very, very elongated galaxies. So the XAR ratio is like 5:1. So very, very edge-on galaxies. Okay, and then they had a normal magnitude range. Okay. And he plotted up the distribution, the number of galaxies in bins, where the x-axis is the position angle on the sky, whether the galaxy is oriented up in the equatorial coordinates or sideways or what. And when we plotted out all the way to 360 degrees, there were 12 spikes. So there was a 12-fold symmetry. But you can see the modulation is like 10 to 1. So from 55 at the maximum and 5 at the minima. So this is an enormous effect. And this was in the mid-2000s. And the year before, there was an article in Nature published about the Dodecahedron Universe. So it came to me, okay, so must be the Dodecahedron Universe. And basically, this means that every galaxy is seen 12 times. Coming so that the same universe replicates as on the faces of a dodecahedron. Okay, because there is no way that, in the data there could be such a perfect 12-fold symmetry. So I tried to caution him. Could this be actually systematic error? And it turns out it was a very, very subtle error. So the way we did the measurements in Sloan, how we measured fluxes and shapes and so on. So we basically created a whole bunch of different classes of galaxies. So there was a bulge, there was a disk, and then there was a position angle. So there was a position angle, and there was also an axial ratio. Okay, and we created basically these models. We didn't want to create, a continuum set of models. We discretized it. So in the position angle, we created basically a grid where 30 galaxies were rotated by 30 degrees. So we were created basically total of 12 bins. But this was not really published anywhere. This was hidden in the belly of the code. Okay, so what happened then? When there was a galaxy which was shaped like this, in a radial bin, we measured, so let's say this was the position angle. So this would be the orientation of the galaxy. There was a certain signal, say 12, whatever, flux unit, and 10 here, and 7 here. So this meant that by fitting basically to these three numbers, we were able to say that this roughly corresponds to a galaxy which is pointing in this way and has such an elongation. But what happens if the galaxy was actually this narrow? Okay, so then it didn't matter whether the galaxy was pointing very close to one of the axes, or whether it's pointing at the center, or whether it was pointing close to the other side of this wedge. We were always we were only computing one model where the galaxy model was placed at the center. So as the model didn't match the real observation, first of all, we got the wrong position angle. It was quantized for these very elongated galaxies, but we also got the wrong flux because we didn't get the magnitude well either, because there were correlated errors. And then in Sloan, this was the number counts. And then we basically made a sharp cut at 17.5. What is brighter than this, it was part of the spectroscopic sample, we observed it. But what happens if the photometric flux was actually randomly modulated according to this error? There were some galaxies which were coming in from the side where there are many more on the other side. And so this created this 10-to-1 modulation in the density of these galaxies. Pretty unbelievable. But anyway, so there is no dodecahedron universe, at least not because of this. But it took us about 6 months to hunt down. But it's good that the student didn't write a paper about this. So, there were two screw-ups that we should have done better. One was that we should not, so generally, you shouldn't have sharp edges in selection boundaries. If you do sharp edges, then you always quantize your data. So here, in the magnitude limit, you quantize your data, whether it's in or out. And here, such elongated galaxies can only exist in the center. So what we should have done is to take the models, and all the models, even the very elongated ones, and we should have actually smoothed them a little, so that actually there is a little flux overflowing to the adjacent bins. And then if it is not exactly at the center, there is a little bit overflowing into the next bin on the right side than to the left, so we can still get the centroid accurately. So a little smoothing and tapering would have helped. And the same way, if we had actually adopted a randomized selection criterion, where this is equivalent almost at basically randomly perturbing the flux of every galaxy by roughly the known error, and then essentially always choosing a little bit, so recover a little bit of information from the other side of the boundary. So don't make a yes or no decision, make a maybe decision. So these are the things that how you can actually minimize such systematic errors. And the third one is photometric redshifts. Photometric redshifts are, when we take the galaxy colors and try to figure out that what is the distance, by how much is the galaxy spectrum shifted towards the red. You can think about this. In Sloan, we had 5 colors, as if we had a 5-band spectrograph. Okay, so it's very crude. We only have 5 pixels in the spectrograph instead of 4,000, but we have 1 billion or half a billion of these. Anyway, so we did all this. We did we did something called the random forest. Essentially, this is an intelligent and fairly robust fitting procedure. We fed the random forest the colors of the galaxies and the fluxes, and there was a training set where we basically gave the redshift of the measured galaxies, and then it created basically, the random forest is really, it first subdivides the training set kind of along the decision tree that. So try to subdivide until we have so-called leaf nodes, which have of the order of 5 or 6 galaxies only, which all have similar redshifts, but also have similar colors. And then normally the way I would do it, in comes a new galaxy for which I don't have a redshift. I start traversing this tree, okay, until I find the bucket that it belongs to, and then I take some weighted average over the neighbors, and that's my estimator. The problem is that this will be very much dependent on how I build this decision tree, how I always split my sample into halves. So a guy, Leo Berman from Berkeley, came up with an idea. Instead of building one decision tree, why don't we build a whole bunch, a forest, where every tree in the forest is basically a separate decision tree where we randomize how we split the object. Furthermore, we also randomly select a subset, a 60%, 50% subset to use the tree. Anyway, this works like a charm. So we did this, and then Chinghua, who was a postdoc with me, she plotted up, again, the deviation from this was a test set, so this is the deviation from the real redshift and the photometric redshift as a function of, again, elongation of the galaxies. Why? Okay, so she suspected that if we have a very elongated galaxy, it's very likely it is edge-on. Okay, if it is edge-on, like when we look through the Milky Way to the plane of the Milky Way is full of dust. Dust basically absorbs light, it creates reddening. So we expected that the galaxies which are edge-on, according to this idea, should have a lot of internal absorption, so they should be redder. And if they are redder, they appear to be actually more distant from us on the average. And lo and behold, indeed they are. And that would be fine because it's a small percentage. But the random forest estimator works in such a way that for the whole sample, it guarantees you an unbiased estimator for the redshift. Okay, so if we screw up in one part of the parameter space, then this means we have an opposite sign error in the rest of 4. So basically every redshift was bad. So the rest of the redshifts were actually a little bit towards to the blue and or lower redshift because of this statistical correctness. So the way to correct it was when we started and feeding also the axial ratio of the galaxies into the training set, this was all taken care of. But this required actually understanding, having a physical model, and then feeding it back into the models when we built basically the statistical analysis. So we basically modeled it out. And this worked. So I hope this kind of showed you a little bit kind of 3 different types of errors. Actually, here is a 4th one, which I think I find the most amusing of all. Okay, so I explained already a little bit how we do the drift scan on Sloan. Okay, and so here is a picture. Really. So imagine that there is an object, say the green object on the top. These are the pixels. Okay, and the object is exactly between 2 pixels when we shift the charges. So the exposure starts at the beginning of at the blue dot under. Maybe I use the laser pointer now. Just a second. Maybe not. That's okay. So basically so you can see that essentially the object moves from the green to the yellow position, and then we clock the CCD again, and then we shift the pixel by 1 pixel to the right. So again we will start exposing, we will collect the charge in the same pixel, and in the end, this object will always spend its whole life. Thank you. It will spend its Yeah, okay. Okay, so it will spend its whole life in a single pixel. But there is another object which started out in the center of this pixel, and then when we move the charges again, it will be in the center of the next pixel, but then we again move this pixel here. So this object will be actually spread its flux evenly between 2 pixels. So this will be broader. Okay. But there is no such effect happening in the transverse direction. So on the average, I would expect that every object in Sloan would be a little bit more elongated in the scan direction. But I also would expect, so this was an under the shower moment. So I was having a shower, and then I suddenly realized, okay, this is not a statistical effect, this is actually a causal effect and depends on the subpixel position of the objects, whether it's exactly at the pixel boundaries or at the center. And of course, this guy, when we fit to the centroid, the center of this object will be placed in the middle of the pixel. Okay, and this object will be placed actually at the pixel boundary because it's equally balanced between 2 adjacent pixels. Okay, so I said, let's run a query in the Sloan database. So, sorry, back here. So let's run a query. This means that essentially, what it means in English, that I compute basically the rho C is the coordinate in a pixel, which pixel, it's a fractional pixel coordinate. I take out the floor, so this is basically a number between 0 and 1, where the object centroid is within a pixel. I multiply it with 100 and discretize it. So this is, I break up the pixel into 100 subpixel positions. And then I basically do the count for about a couple of 100 million stars. Okay, this is the result. Indeed, this is the more negative, the more elongated. So the object in the center of the pixel is the least elongated, just as expected. And the ones which are closer to the edge of the pixel are the ones which are most elongated. And the effect is actually quite substantial. So, so maybe of the order of about a little below 1%, but big enough to actually impact some of the gravitational weak lensing results. Cause a systematics there. But then something occurred to me. So the peak of this distribution is not at the center. It's about 10% off. What the hell is going on? So along comes Jim Gunn, the guy from Princeton who built the camera, and kind of the rest of Sloan. And so I showed him this figure, and he said, You know, we don't just simply issue a clock signal and then we move the charges. It takes time to move the charges. So we issue 3 clock signals. The first one shuts down the exposure. The second one moves the charges. Then we again start collecting. And this little interval is 10%. So we see essentially on the elongation of stars in Sloan how the CCD how Jim Gunn set up the timing of the Sloan camera. So we can read off the electronic clock signals of the sky. So I think this is actually pretty cool and very subtle. So okay. Simulations. So we have been talking about collecting large amounts of data, say, from the sky. And there is a lot going on. LSST is going to collect 60 petabytes of imaging data in 10 years. There are lots of surveys going on. SK, the Square Kilometer Array, claims they will collect close to an exabyte of data. But the supercomputers are starting to generate, basically behaving like instruments in their own right. So there was the Millennium Simulation for cosmology. Then that had 10 billion particles. The Millennium XXL simulation had 300 billion particles. So some of the argon simulations are now at 1 trillion particles. So they are really starting to be very massive data sets. And these go from supernovae to turbulence, but even in biology and brain modeling. And so everywhere in physics. The idea is that people really want to be able to play with this data. But how can one do this when the data sets are starting to become larger and larger? And most of the time, the way we play with the simulations, we actually download the files to our system. But what do you do when it starts to be 200 terabytes or a petabyte? Kind of it's end of the game. So we are starting to explore. And the first was based upon Sloan. Herald Lamson and Garshing built a database from the Millennium Simulation, which started in the year 2000 and finished around 2005. And it is still up to today one of the most used simulations of the world because it's easy to use. So there is a database and you can observe it like the sky in the Sloan survey, except that you can search for the whole formation history of every galaxy in it. So with a single query, you can find out basically what is the parentage of the single galaxy. So this came from all these proto-galaxies. So from the mergers, and we have the whole merger tree. So this is beautiful. So there are other simulations which are on different scales. So this was done by Pierre Amadou and Joachim Steidl, and so on, Joachim Steidl. And the idea was, what could we do to avoid downloading these simulations? And Rosie was one of the people, Rosie Weiss at Hopkins. So she found some of these cold streams in the Milky Way, which is the remnant of a dwarf galaxy colliding with the Milky Way, which was then basically tidally broken up and eaten up entirely by the Milky Way. This is called Galactic Archaeology. And this shows this, you can't see too well on this projection. This is, by the way, a picture done by an amateur in New Mexico. A 24-hour, one of the lowest surface brightness images ever made. So here you can see a very faint trace of a dwarf galaxy which passed through the plane of this galaxy, starting to leave behind a trail of stars, crossed over, leaving even more, and now this is roughly where it is right now. So after a couple more orbits, it will basically completely turn into streams. Anyway, so we teamed up with Car Berg from Toronto. And, oops, sorry, what did happen here? Okay. So this is, you don't see the Milky Way, but you see the dwarf galaxy that we shot into it. So you can take your laptop and shoot a dwarf galaxy into the Milky Way, and you can see how basically the originally compact galaxy, after each orbit, it gets more and more tidally disrupted and elongated. But because of Liouville's theorem, it still forms kind of a contiguous surface. So as it is getting basically more and more elongated, in the orthogonal directions, it's getting colder and colder. So it will form basically a very cold strip Okay, and we have actually, in the end, generated several hundred of these. And it's really cool. So, and it behaves, so far people have done this only in a very simple ellipsoidal scalar potential, because that's all they could do, how to simulate. So here we take actually the real, very rugged potential of the real galaxy, and you can basically play this game from a laptop. So you can shoot your particles in. And this is, of course, many, many orbital times, but anyway, but you can see the result. It can be quite complex. So what happens in the simulation front? So we are starting to hit trillion particles, and it starts to become, people want to do all sorts of things, want to compute dark matter annihilation. Is there actually a sign for dark matter annihilation coming from the galactic center? Is the signal that the Fermi satellites is real? So, or, in the Millennium XXL simulation, the storage for storing all the dark matter particles was too much, so they couldn't do it. They only stored the so-called halos. Halos are basically clusters of from a few thousand to a few million dark matter particles, which are the sites where the galaxies are going to form. And these are the first such halo finding algorithm was done by Press and Schechter in 1974. It's based on the so-called friend of friends algorithm. Okay, so, and then what you can see is that there are more and more of these halo finding algorithms, which are all have subtle differences. Okay, this is the friends of friends. So essentially, you define as closure lengths or a link length, and if there are two particles which are separated less than this distance, you connect them. These are friends. And if a particle is connected to another particle, then you connect them all together. So these form clusters. So this is the friends of a friend is a friend. This is called disjunctive closure in mathematics. And this defines basically all these halos. And then afterwards, these are typically gravitationally bound. So you can define a centroid, you can find the binding energy, etc. You can compute the physical parameters after those. But you have to go through this linking algorithms, which is pretty slow, because you have to search for all the neighbors. And typically, you have to keep all the particles in memory. And so what does this mean? So even though we may have 100 algorithms for halo finders, but really what will happen is that you need a supercomputer to run any of those, and you have to load in the original result. So nobody else has really a chance other than the original guys who ran the simulation. So, and we were wondering, can we do something better? Could we find a technique whereby we can at least find the biggest halos, the dominant halos in a simulation, without having to put them all into memory at once? And I have a friend at Hopkins who is working on streaming algorithms. So he's a mathematician, but he's one of the top guys in the world. And so let me sketch out the idea. So there is a way, so first of all, let's translate it to a simpler problem. Imagine that I subdivide the volume of the simulation into lots of very high resolution cells, but many billions of cells. And I want to find, say, the 10 million highest density cells. This is not quite the same as the friends of friends, but if I can solve this problem, I can take this million highest density cells and then search around them and build the halos, basically. So if I can do this in a clever way, then we have a chance to solve this in a much more computationally efficient way. So in streaming, there is something called the heavy hitters problem. So imagine that you have a stream of numbers, say out of, you know that the value of the numbers can be, say, 1 billion, from 1 to 1 billion. But you don't know what is the frequency. What would a physicist do? How would you solve this problem? I would set up a histogram of 1 billion wide and then keep adding 1 whenever something hits that bucket. And then keep looking at, what is basically the top 1 million cells in the histogram. And when it starts to stabilize, then I say, okay, let's stop, and this is it. But this requires 1 billion storage. And if I have 1 trillion cells, it would require 1 trillion white histograms. So it's too expensive, not necessary computationally, because I can still do it in a single pass through the data sequentially, but it would require too much storage. Could I do this in logarithmics? Knowing that I'm not interested in the perfect histogram, I'm only interested in the heavy hitters. Okay. There's a guy called Muthu Krishnan at Rutgers who came up with this brilliant idea that he called sketching. Okay, so anybody knows what a hash function is? So if I have a data item, so say a number, I can create this is like the so-called MD5, the checksum, the cyclic redundancy checksum. So I create at the end of a file, I create a CRC. If something changes in the file, I recompute this number will be different. So it's a deterministic function which maps a very large block of data potentially onto a single number. Okay, so imagine that I set up a matrix. Say 16,000 elements in one row, and say 16 rows. So this is much less than 1 trillion. Okay, so in comes a particle which carries with itself the label, this serial number of the cell. So it's a number between 1 and 1 trillion, which is created from the XYZ coordinates. We compute these hash functions, and say the first hash function will basically say 7. So the hash function is limited to have a number, an output between, say, 1 and 16,000. So it will select us exactly one cell out of this. So this is like a Rook's problem on an uneven chessboard. In every row, there will be always just one cell. And then we set another hash function, which gives me a +1 or -1. So if it's a +1, then I increase the value of this cell by +1. If it's -1, I decrease it by 1. Okay, so what happens? So this particular cell ID, the serial number of this cell, corresponds to this particular pattern. So it's not stored as a single histogram, but a combination of a bunch of values. Okay, so if I have a large number of cells with the particles in the same cell, this will be a frequent value. So say 1 million particles in the same cell. Then I have added by the end of the day, 1 million times +1 to this cell 7. I added -1 million to the second row, another -1 million there, and so on. Okay, so this pattern will kind of grow. There will be, of course, other cells which may have 1 million particles, and some of these cells may coincide, so there will be some of these which will contain 2 million particles. But it turns out the median of these values will give me the correct count in the end. So there will be up and down fluctuations. What will happen with all the cells which are kind of in the noise, which are not heavy hitters? They are appearing as a noise, as a random noise, where basically you randomly generate +1 and -1, which cancel out. And this just adds kind of a little noise to the distribution. So I will never get the perfect count, but I will get a very accurate, approximate count. This is called sketching, and it's a beautiful idea. How to store something in a logarithmic space, essentially. It's how to build a histogram in a logarithmic space. And works like a charm. So for the Millennium, the 10 billion particles, we were able to build the halos in 5 minutes on a single GPU on a single laptop. So it was, and we were just I/O limited, essentially. How fast could we read in? Okay. Via Lactea. This is now again about algorithms, but also hardware. So sometimes hardware can help. So this is the Via Lactea simulation, and originally when they ran it, one of the goals was to try to estimate what is the gamma ray signal from the center of the Milky Way. So Michael Coolant, who was a postdoc with Piero, he wrote a code. It took him 8 hours to render this image on a fairly decent computer. And then, one of my graduate students won all sorts of programming contests in China, so he was a computing whiz. And so I asked him to look into, could we actually translate this code to GPUs to run much faster? And he did that, and he got it down by recoded the same algorithm on a GPU in CUDA, and he got it down to 1 hour. And this was not good enough, so I was hoping for something better. And then we realized that this is really a visualization problem. So what we want is to create an image simply projecting the density of the particles, except that we want it to project the density square of the particles, because that corresponds to the annihilation rate. And so he wrote something in GL, OpenGL, which is the rendering language of these GPU cards. Much of the core of the code was roughly 10 lines, which he ran on every one of the objects. And it ran on his Mac-based laptop with the built-in GPU, which is not the powerful GPU, in 24 seconds, using a technique called point sprites. So we basically generated, he created an interactive web service where one can actually rotate this on using WebGL, and you can look at the galaxy. Then you can create all sorts of, and you can do one of the simulations in 24 seconds. We wrote a bunch of papers with Joe Silk, where we started to change the cross-section. So this is why interactive is so important, irrespective of the size of the data. You want to do interactive because it gives you a rapid feedback. Anyway, and here are basically the same dwarf galaxy in the simulation. The only thing is what sort of corrections did we put in for the cross-section. And you can see that it look very different. So, okay. And then the last bit I would like to talk about. So I spent much of my life working on spatial correlation functions. So a lot of overlap with Sabino. So we did higher order correlation functions and all that. So 2 years ago, there was a new institute started at Hopkins in cancer immunotherapy. So this is when how do you trick the body's immune system to start attacking the cancer cells by giving a certain drug. And in some cases, 30% of the patients recover within 2 weeks, and then on the other 70%, it has no effect. And people are trying to figure out why this is. But anyway, so this is my collaborator, Jenny Staub. And so this is how kind of some of these, so they are taking 35 color images of cancer tissues. But they typically take they take the slices of the tumors, and then they take typically 5 to 10 images of this. So a tiny fraction of this slide. And then they spend hours and hours visually looking at it and trying to click on what is a cancer cell, so visually classifying. And the end, they want something like what we created with the Sky Survey. So something where you can actually look at the images, overlay actually the galaxies and stars, but here you want to overlay the immune cells and cancer cells, and then study the spatial interactions. So if somebody was given a drug, if the immune cells start to penetrate the tumor membranes, then that is a sign that this person will respond well to treatment. A treatment currently is a few $100,000 per person. So it's important to select well. Anyway, so basically spatial is everywhere. Let me just show. So this is how a sky mosaic looks from Sloan. So we kind of cover the sky with overlapping images. And this is now what we are trying to do with the tissues. So instead of taking just every one of those is a roughly 1,500 by 1,000 image. And this is a single, 1-inch slide that you normally put under the microscope. And so we are now trying to do about, this case it was 1,200 images, most likely it will be 2,000. So we are trying to increase the amount of data that they can take by almost a factor of 1,000. So for a single microscope, you can generate a petabyte of data in a year. And we would like to use the overlapping areas to measure consistency so that we run the image segmentation and the pattern recognition algorithms on both halves of the overlapping image and then compare the results, so to get an intrinsic control. And then do the spatial correlation functions. And then they have even the technology, once they see an interesting cell that they are interested in, they can cut it, they can lift up the glass, cut it with a micro laser, cut it off the tissue and lift it off with a nanomanipulator and then sequence that single cell. and get basically the full single cell sequencing to identify thousands of different genes. So anyway, so the end sociology, that's the end. So basically what we see is because of the big data, we see very broad sociological changes. First of all, science has been always kind of drifting into, so it started out as natural philosophy and then became physics, mathematics, chemistry, biology. Then it became theoretical physics, theoretical chemistry, and experimental physics. Then we got computational physics. So it was kind of always subdividing into smaller and smaller subdisciplines. What we see today, because of the data revolution, is a convergence. So the biologists are starting to use the same computational techniques as physicists, and even in systems biology, they try to simulate, basically like an n-body simulation, how a living cell or how a living organism is working. So this is fundamentally different. Data collection is happening in larger and larger collaborations. The Sky Survey in astronomy is a good example. The LHC is a good example in particle physics. But there is an equivalent of this for genomics, the Human Genome Project, and there is now, I think, 10,000 or 100,000 genomes in the UK, million genomes in China. So it's going everywhere. But what is interesting that these collaborations are now getting to the point when they don't even want to do all the analysis. They do some key projects, but otherwise they make the data public in a fairly well-packaged shrink wrap way, and then invite essentially the people from the outside to do much of the analysis. And what has been remarkable, also seeing on Sloan that we see the emergence of not just citizen scientists, because they are, a birdwatcher is also a citizen scientist, but the internet scientists. So people who typically have a PhD or highly educated are doing something else but have a nostalgia for science. On the Sloan database, we see among our users 5 million distinct IP addresses who actually run analysis on Sloan. There are about 15,000 professional astronomers in the world. So where do the rest of them come from? And there were some computer gamers discovered a new class of galaxy called green peas, which are highly ionized bubbles surrounding the whole galaxy. There was a paper published in Nature where the computer gamers got credit for the discovery. A Dutch school teacher discovered an object which was so strong emission lines that there was only one such other object known in the universe. And this was observed by Space Telescope. So these discoveries are starting to come once you make this data available. How do we train the next generation? And this is why this program that you're starting is so important. So the traditional higher education trains people who are eye-shaped. So very narrow and very deep in their own field. And the longer you proceed in your education, the deeper you get, but at the same time also narrower. And as one is getting older like I am, we develop kind of a T-shaped. So we develop a superficial knowledge across multiple fields so that we can talk to our colleagues in other departments. But it's really not as deep as you get with a decade of training. But what we need in this world today is that people have to be just as familiar with some of the fundamentals of this elusive subject called data science, which is a mixture of computer science, statistics, computational science, probability theory, all of the above. But you have to be just as at home as physicists are with mathematics. We can't go to a mathematician friend every time we encounter an equation. We dealt with this hundreds of years ago, so it's taken that everybody in the hard sciences must know mathematics. I think what is happening today is that everybody in the sciences will have to learn data science, because when you collect so much data, if you organize the data the wrong way, the analysis is undoable. It takes a Hubble time to do. But if you organize it just the right way, you can do it in an hour. And this will make all the difference for the success of the science. And you have to be able to see the way through all the pitfalls. So this is the level you have to accommodate data science. And the earlier this starts, the better, because if you want to be native in another field, Later on, when you are on a faculty track or an academic track, it's too late. You never have the time to spend the time to get deep in a particular area. So start early, please. And I think you are, with this new program, you are really well on the way. So summarizing, large data sets are here. We need new approaches. So the statistics not only has to be unbiased and all the other things that we usually know, it also has to be computable. Because if we can't compute it, forget it. It's all about systematic errors and streaming, sampling, and robust techniques. I didn't talk much about robust, really, but then we need to, many of these problems are in very high dimensions, so we have to sparsify. We have to figure out what is the sparse representation so that we don't have to deal with millions of dimensions. Everything is about populations and statistical properties. And astronomy is undergoing a rapid change. And it's important to think about for a second why. Okay, so in life sciences, people can go back to the lab and then mix different things together and then try out a new result. I have not seen an astronomer who had been able to turn a dial and then a star went ping on the sky. All that we can do is observe the sky at different wavelengths and derive our hypothesis. So we can't actively pursue our hypothesis. We always have to passively pursue our hypothesis. And everybody in astronomy learned, for thousands of years that all that we can do is to basically observe the sky in clever, different ways. And this is why astronomy is undergoing a rapid change. I think our community was able to respond much faster to these challenges than any other scientific discipline. Maybe particle physics was the other exception. But what we will see is more data from fewer telescopes. And we will have this new paradigm of analyzing large public data sets. So everybody in the world will have equal chance. So in a sense, what we see also is a large democratization of these large facilities. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Questions? Time for some quick questions. I was just curious. Nobody has question. I start. You showed your fight against systematic errors with some nice example for Sloan Digital Sky surveys. If you have similar, if you're encountering, surely you're encountering similar problems now. I don't know for LSST. If you're, similar problems. There are new specific challenges.
If we knew what they are going to be, I would call it calibration. So I think we will probably discover tons of those in LSST. And it will be kind of a really interesting puzzle-solving journey. It won't more than an exercise. It will take probably 10 years. In Sloan, it took 10 years to figure many of these out.
Anything else?
Can you make a sort of very general question, which is, we are faced to, in these moments, there are various ways to approach science and approach physics, okay? I have the impression that theoretical particle physicists still go in a direction which is far from this one. Do you think that also in that direction, people will move in a direction which goes more towards data science? And I'm not referring to experimental particle physics. They already have this attitude, but in theoretical particle physics, there is still a different way to approach system. I start from a Lagrangian, then I calculate Feynman diagrams, etc.
So certainly, one of the kind of free associations that's come to mind without knowing the answer is that also, at least, they're the way, I think more of them are using symbolic tools like Mathematica and so on. Not quite data science, but at least the computational techniques are impacting that. And I know of some cases when people were using actually machine learning in large simulations to discover hidden symmetries in the system. And then I can see that maybe that in theoretical physics, people will actually generate some simulations from the first principles, but actually try to use such data techniques to discover where are there actually any hidden symmetries in a very complex system. So maybe I can see much more how, for example, in physics of complex systems, this is already kind of penetrating that field. So yeah. Thank you very much.